good relationships become a sort of psychological PPE for us, so that when we are placed in a stressful situation, the hull of the ship that we've been building together is strong. It's ready to weather that turbulence. And if we're not doing those small things on the front end, then we don't really have anything in the bank account to draw against. And so it's not something to do in the moment when you're asking for a favor or you're asking people to go the extra mile.
And that term went right past, you said the cloak of PPE or the hull of PPE. What did you just say?
Sorry, I mixed a boat, a plane, and PPE together. Didn't fully explain it. So let me back up a little bit.
Hello and welcome to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. I'm your host, Lee Scheinbart, and this podcast brings you the hottest and most crucial conversations in healthcare and physician leadership. Our guest today is Dr. Katherine Meese. With 15 years of experience in healthcare management, leadership, and research, Dr. Meese is on a mission to use science to help healthcare leaders keep their people and keep them well. To her credit, Dr. Meese is an award-winning scholar regarding organizational behavior and well-being and has co-authored 2 textbooks on organizational behavior in healthcare that are used nationwide. The first is The Human Margin, Building the Foundations of Trust. And the second is Genfluence, How to Lead a Multi-Generational Workforce. Presently, Dr. Meese is on the faculty at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and also serves as an advisory board member for Belmont University Frist College of Medicine, Collaborative for Health Systems Innovation. Dr. Meese has been very gracious to join us and to share what I think are some rather profound insights about how to lead in healthcare today. Katherine, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be with you.
I really appreciate you doing this with us because I think I mentioned when we talked before, when I discovered your work, it had an immediate impact on my brain and subsequently the way I think about organizational leadership. And then you and I spoke further about your work, and it only further solidified my awareness such that I asked you to share it with our audience, many of whom are in the healthcare leadership space. But for those that are unfamiliar with the work, would you mind just orienting our listeners a little bit to this space, the space that you've explored, and why are you so particularly devoted to this mission, sort of with the beginner in mind, if you will? How did you come to this?
I actually didn't start my career in healthcare. I started in oil and gas working in finance, but I got here as fast as I could. And one of the most surprising things to me when I transitioned from sort of this industry that's not particularly known for being altruistic into healthcare is that I thought because healthcare is a caring industry, it's an altruistic industry, that we would take really good care of our people. And as you can imagine, when I got here, that is not what we found. And I remember where I was sitting still in my oil and gas job, waiting to transition and go back to graduate school, when I found out that healthcare workers or medical residents will work a 30-hour shift, like not during a natural disaster, just on a Tuesday. And so it is so surprising to me still that sometimes, even though humans are the only way that we can produce care, that we don't always give them the attention and maintenance that we would give to a piece of machinery that's our main means of production. And so that got me really interested in exploring how we can rehumanize this work so that ultimately patients can get the best possible care.
Well, you're hitting a soft spot relative to how we behave in healthcare, and we're going to keep digging into this. So I know you've got a lot to share. But one thing you didn't mention, but you did share with me before, there's a family member close to you that is in healthcare. Would you care to explain some of the observations you began to have relative to that person's career and how that also shaped you a little bit into where we're going?
Yes. So I married my husband when his second year of medical school, and then was surprised for like the next 10 years at sort of the conditions that he found himself in terms of his work environment, what was expected of him, how he was expected to sort of make life and death decisions on very little sleep or with very little support. And so that furthered my interest in this space. And so I actually started working once I finished my doctoral work as an embedded researcher within a healthcare system. And I was responsible for conducting wellness research. And this was right before the COVID pandemic. And so when the pandemic hit, I had an opportunity to really get into the details across the entire healthcare workforce, physicians, nurses, APPs, non-clinical, and understand what was driving their distress. And probably not a surprise to anyone here, but a surprise to me as a researcher, is that the main things causing that distress, it wasn't the pandemic necessarily. It was the feeling of betrayal or lack of support from their organizations or leadership. And so people were showing up to do the work. They were ready. This is what they've trained for. But the lack of support, I think, really is what created deep distress for so many people during that time. So that got me even more interested in this work, and not only seeing that as a researcher, but seeing that, as a spouse of someone who was intubating COVID patients with questionable PPE.
Thank you for sharing that. I wasn't trying to open up any Pandora's box, but it is meaningful, I think, for those of us who want to shape healthcare and healthcare leadership to really understand what we're talking about. We're talking about people at the bedside helping other people. And so your story resonates with me, and I know it resonates with a lot of our leaders. So let's start really getting into this together. You have said in your writings and in conversations, healthcare is humans working with humans to heal humans. And for the CMO, the chief medical officer, who feels buried in metrics and meetings and crisis pandemics notwithstanding, how do you think they should personally stay connected to that human core? And how do they model that connection so it cascades all the way down to those service line leaders, the medical directors, to the frontline teams, and to the people in the room taking care of other people?
I think from a very business oriented perspective, it is easy to get caught up in the metrics and the things that you're supposed to do for your performance to hit financial and operational targets. But I think here the real key is the order of operations, getting the first things first. Like I said, in other industries, there is a very clear recognition about what is the means of production for that business, right? If it is an oil rig in the middle of the ocean, if it's a refinery, that's what you're going to prioritize and take the best care of. And I think in healthcare, somehow we've gotten so focused on metrics and performance that we sort of forget that our entire means of production is the person, it's the human in front of us. And so I think taking great care of that instrument, if you will, is fundamental to every other business and operational metric that we need to hit. That said, we can't turn people up like we would turn up machinery. And so there are very specific conditions under which people operate and function optimally. And so I think as leaders, and particularly as physician leaders, it's so important for us to keep that front and center because we will not achieve any of those other business metrics without it. And so one thing that I encourage people to do, if they're not already, is to track what's happening when they lose a physician from the workforce, when someone chooses to take a job elsewhere, or when they choose to reduce clinical hours. What is that doing to your revenue and financial performance? Because often we know there's a connection. We've read about this connection in the literature, but that number is something that is so helpful, I think, for people recognizing and remembering that without this thing, we don't get any of those other performance benefits.
The analogy is really insightful for me, right? When I think about equipment, and I've never been in the oil industry or gas industry, but I did drive a 2-ton dump truck through high school as a job working for the city, and we laid what was called pitch on the road, which is tar. And you had to do your preventative maintenance on the equipment. You had to give it to the guys in the shop to keep everything going day in and day out, or week in and week out. It's not knowable by most people. I know you have knowledge about this. What is the preventative maintenance for those bedside workers? Because when they come offline, you're right, your productivity, that productivity goes down, but the whole ward, the whole, hall, the whole unit, the whole OR, it takes a hit because someone's got to pick up that slack, and it's not an infinite amount of workers, if you will. So does that logic make sense?
It does. So the way we would do this in a manufacturing industry is through routine maintenance and scheduled downtime. And so I think the same principles apply in healthcare. Routine maintenance, what does that look like? We're going to be thinking about all the dimensions of well-being. There's 7 different types of rest. So when we think about scheduled downtime, people need social rest, they need emotional rest, mental rest, sensory rest, which is very hard to get if you go from a clinical environment with constant beeping to documenting after hours for many hours with constant notifications and alerts. We need creative rest. We need the ability to do things outside of our normal scope that rejuvenate us in that way. And of course, physical rest. And so all of those components are really critical for that scheduled downtime piece.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, alarm fatigue is a very real phenomenon, and you have got to disconnect people from those alarms and those beeps. Now, maybe some technology will come to help us, but it's still some human has to make some human level decision about what's going on. So I love that. Okay. Next question. So your research shows that trust in senior leadership predicts turnover more strongly than trust in the immediate supervisor or even the pay that the worker is receiving. So again, put the chief medical officer hat on. What does the CMO have to do personally or do differently week in and week out to be seen as trustworthy by the clinicians who may never step foot in the C-suite or get that personal relationship with the most senior leader?
Yeah, so there's sort of this belief sometimes, I think, among clinicians or physicians specifically, that when one rises to the ranks of C suite leadership, their lightsaber changes colors, right? They go from being one of us to being one of them. And I'm a huge believer that when people understand all of the constraints of a decision that you have to make, usually they will arrive at the same logical conclusion. So I think transparency in this area is probably the number one thing that I would say contributes to building trust in that space. Often people assume that you have nefarious purposes because they just don't know all of the constraints of that decision making. And they don't necessarily see how those decisions interact with an entire system because they're sort of relegated into a specific division or department. So I think transparency is thing one. We also have to, of course, manage our own behaviors and do trustworthy behaviors, which I think is pretty obvious: honesty, owning our mistakes, having competence in that role. But beside that, we also see in our research that there's some things that get in the way of that senior trust relationship that have nothing to do with the senior leader. And the biggest thing that we see is sort of this middle management trust gap where people at lower levels of the organization don't understand why decisions are being made, or they don't know how to answer hard questions. So when they get asked those questions, they're going to throw the top under the bus, right? So if a residency director is getting hard questions from their medical residents and they don't really understand or know how to answer that, then they might throw the CMO under the bus. And so one of the most important things we can do as senior leaders is to help those people answer those hard questions. And so you can do this exercise with your team. It's as simple as saying, what hard questions are you getting from your people? And then you come up with something together that's values aligned and that's authentic and transparent. Because if I can't trust the senior leadership of the organization, it's hard for me to be proud of where I work, and people want to be proud of where they work.
You know, it's been said, not by me originally, some of the most simple things are the hardest things. And asking somebody, so what are the hard questions, is a simple ask, but then it's really hard to make sure that you've given the right information, that they feel equipped. So it's even bigger than that because you have to say, are you comfortable with this? What kind of skill development do you need to be able to address this question? And if they push back, are you prepared? And what are you going to say? Because human nature may be you end up throwing somebody under the bus because you're not ready for the whole conversations.
Well, I think there's also a component of this that sometimes you need to cut out the filtering that happens at different layers of the organization. If your message or the way that you're communicating as a senior leader isn't getting through without being really distorted at each level of the organization, sometimes you might need to carry that message directly. And that might look like rounding, attending staff meetings, showing up at huddles, regularly scheduled meetings so that you're not adding to people's workload to help deliver the message yourself, and in turn, build trust with those middle levels of leadership because you're demonstrating to them, hey, I'm willing to take the heat of my own decision. I'm not leaving you to take the heat for what I'm deciding.
100% agree. That's very helpful as well. You have said on many occasions that no humans, no margin, no mission. So if you were sitting in the chief medical officer chair tomorrow, not at your husband's institution, somewhere else,
I don't think we would make it.
yeah, we don't want to go there. What are the maybe first 2 or 3 non-negotiable human margin metrics that you'd put on that dashboard right next to length of stay or readmissions or time in the OR? What might you be thinking about that are non-negotiable as a chief medical officer in terms of human behavior?
If your organization is not regularly measuring employee engagement, including items like trust in senior leadership, trust in supervisor, feeling a sense of decisional involvement, autonomy, that's the first place to start. And I'm surprised still how many organizations are not doing that regularly, or they'll measure once every 3 years. That's going to tell you nothing. So having that measurement in place, I think, is really important. Beyond that, I would be looking at 2 elements. The benefits that you have in place that allow people to recuperate, things like vacation time, things like maternity or paternity leave. Are people using it? And sick time too. Are people actually using it? If not, you have a pretty good indication that you might have a culture where people do not feel permission to rest or to recuperate or recover. That is going to be very hard to do that scheduled downtime if people don't feel permission to use the benefits that they've been given. And then the third thing I would say is making sure that you're also looking at first year turnover and voluntary turnover altogether, not just in the physician workforce, because it is very hard to have a happy physician, I believe, surrounded by a constantly changing team of disappointed or disgruntled nurses, APPs, and support staff.
Yeah, on that last point, that became blaringly obvious through the pandemic and afterwards when we saw a lot of individuals leave the workforce and we bring in a new team and expect the surgeon or the anesthesiologist to behave as though it was just yesterday. But you have how do you get to know these people? They've been dropped in with parachutes on you or whatever the circumstances are. So I think you are right. Team stability, team development, and making sure everybody has the requisite downtime, not only the staff, but the physicians as well, so that you come together as a well-oiled team. And that takes work. You can't just drop people in, right?
Yeah, it takes work, it takes practice, and sometimes that's not feasible. You're at a giant academic medical center, you're going to have a different combination of strangers in the OR. So you have to have some really strong shared values and norms to make that work. But often, preventable churn is a huge stressor, and it causes a lot of role conflict where people are having to sort of renegotiate. Where does, the APP end and where does the physician begin? That's a challenging environment.
Agreed. So in the human margin, you and Quint Studer describe 10 building blocks of trust, as I recall. And if CMOs can only realistically focus on a few levers at a time, can you name 2 trust building behaviors from a senior medical leadership perspective that have sort of the fastest and most visible impact on clinician well-being and retention?
Right. So the first one I would say is rounding. If you're not rounding, you need to be rounding. Going to where the work is actually being produced and seeing what's going on there. Talking to your people, talking to people who don't report to you, right? Who are members of that care team. Oftentimes we design our organizational structures in a way that does not at all reflect the way that work gets done. And so we're surprised when a team of nurses reporting over here and APPs reporting up to a different leader and clinicians, support staff reporting somewhere else and physicians reporting somewhere else. We're shocked that there's not a shared language, expectations, goals, and alignment. And so going to where the work is done, I think is very important. I think if possible, and this is a tall ask, particularly when the plate is full, if there is an opportunity to continue practicing clinically, even a small amount, a shift here and there, so that you can experience the environment that you're creating for your people, that is important. I'll add to that some of the leaders that I've seen do that in the most trust-building ways are the ones that will pick up the weekend shift, they'll work the holiday shift, they'll work the night shift, even though it is completely in their power to not get the bad shift on the schedule. But they do that as a means of building trust.
So on this second point, this is one of the most touchy subjects amongst aspiring physician leaders and chief medical officers across the United States. And every conference, every lecture, every course that I'm involved with, this question always comes up. And I used to have a very, very rigid thought about this, and I have expanded my thinking. And I would just add a caveat to our listeners. It sort of depends on where you are geographically and where you are from a career perspective and what career you're in. So if you can do it, if it makes sense to do it, if you're enabled and empowered and you get scheduled downtime, go for it. It is such a highly personal thing when I really talk to people about it. But yes, you can earn trust elbow to elbow very, very quickly as opposed to rounding once a week or for a few minutes a day. And so I agree with you, but with that caveat.
And I think it's not going to be a fit in every environment, right? But I think there are other ways to do that, to show up, to be visible, to be helpful. And more than being visible yourself, you're not there to be seen, but to see others, to see their situation, right? And to acknowledge and notice.
And for new leaders, it can be very off-putting. One day you used to wear a white coat or a stethoscope, and next you're rounding with a different colored lightsaber, as you indicated, and people don't want to talk to you suddenly. Well, you have been involved in some very large scale studies of burnout. I think I read about 6,000 respondents to one of your surveys, and relative to moral distress and the climate of burnout. And when a physician looks at their organization and thinks, we have a burnout climate problem, which I love that phrase, what are some of the best evidence based interventions that you can share where the CMO can champion that makes things better or things that might make things worse for that matter?
Right. So we have several factors that influence burnout. People tend to jump to workload, and that is one of six factors. There are other things like a sense of community at work, lack of fairness, moral distress, recognition, and autonomy. And so I think for physicians specifically, what I hear a lot about is the fairness component and the autonomy component. There has been sort of a downward pressure on physician autonomy, I think, over the last 20 to 30 years, where we've seen people move into more employment models where there's, very rigid protocols around what the organization needs and how they expect things to be done relative to maybe what we had seen historically. And so I think it's really important for leaders to focus on what are the areas where we can give people autonomy. We don't want people having autonomy about how they scrub in, right? We want them following best practices. We want safety protocols in place. I want no autonomy in that process. That said, things like scheduling, right? Self-scheduling. It might be that you automatically lottering people into their late shifts and holidays could be done in a more thoughtful way where people could say, hey, you know what? Tuesday's not a good day for me because I coach my son's soccer team, but Wednesday I could care less about. So as long as it's not Tuesday. And so the more you can give people some sense of control over things that matter to them, I think that's critically important for the burnout equation. And then the other piece I'll say, and this relates to workload and can also relate to autonomy if you involve people in this process, is getting rid of stupid stuff. It's a great intervention that was developed by Dr. Melinda Ashton. And it's essentially this. You ask people what's your stupid stuff. As long as it's not a moral, legal, or ethical or safety related issue, you get rid of the stupid stuff, wash, rinse, repeat. And so when we're thinking about rounding and pushing through that discomfort of, a new role in that space, one of the questions that I encourage people to ask is, what's your stupid stuff? Because I will tell you, when I ask this question all over the country, I have not had a single person in healthcare be like, we don't have any. Everything's great. It's like, you better make sure you have some time and a chair available because you're going to get fearful. So,
Yeah.
so not only asking, but then involving people in, okay, let's figure out how we fix this and making progress on that and communicating that progress back.
Yeah. One of my good buddies, an orthopedic surgeon, a trauma surgeon, I've worked with him for many, many years. He used to tell me, the team will go to bat for you if you go to bat for them. If they want to do this work, and if you help build capacity, and we'll get into capacity in a moment, they will do what we're talking about. But if you run from it, hide from it, don't reduce it, et cetera, or open up opportunities, they're not going to be inclined to go to bat, or they'll run out of energy in their battery to go to bat. So I love those notions, and I hope our listeners take that to heart and do some of those. And those are relatively straightforward things. We did it in COVID. We got rid of a ton of stupid stuff, and then we
And then we
brought
added it back in.
and then we added it back in. You took the words right out of my mouth. It's stupid stuff returning. Anyway. All right. So you emphasize in your work how to translate the science that you have investigated relative to this, what we're talking about, into repeatable daily practices. And if you were to give a new CMO sort of a 90-day plan on a human margin sprint, what are three very small concrete things that would just take a few minutes that they could start to adopt in their regular practice to help move this forward?
First things first, get those metrics that we talked about in place. And I would also include in that pajama time. How many people are documenting at home from their home device after hours? That doesn't automatically mean that it's a problem, right? You might have some people who say, look, I'm going to get home, put my kid to bed, and it's more important for me to get home early so I can see my child, and then I'm going to do that later. That works for me. But if that's happening to a great degree, that's something that needs to be tracked very closely. So first things first, get those metrics in place so that you're not flying blind, right? Everything else we do in medicine is based on evidence and data. Sometimes we need to put those systems in place so we can treat leadership the same way. The next thing I'll say is notice and thank. It's a phrase that needs to be deeply embedded. We as leaders need to become world-class noticers about all the things people are doing well and right. and consistently thank them for those things. I know so many healthcare workers, both physicians and non physicians, who are deeply committed to the work. They're passionate about it. They love what they do. They just want someone to say thank you. And that's all they need to keep going. But they want to feel seen, acknowledged, and noticed. And so the mantra to ourselves, I think, is notice and thank whenever we can.
So that's the capacity issue that I'm talking about. And you've written about this. So I'm stealing and borrowing and spreading it around. If you acknowledge people, if you make them feel valued, if you thank them, if you notice things, all of that is building the capacity to do the work. And it goes back to my comment about my orthopedic surgeon friend. If you do the things to build that mental capacity, they'll even work harder than you thought they would work. And I don't understand why it's taken us decades to even have this conversation that you and I are having, because it should be common sense. If you don't allow for people, and I'm not talking about time off or downtime, I'm talking about in the moment. Hey, we got to add on this case, and it's going to be a tough one, but are you guys, and you have to invest on that on the front end of the morning or the day before or the week before, not when they're all tired and ready to leave. And then you make an ask that they just don't have the capacity they become resigned to it rather than invested in it. Am I making any sense whatsoever? Okay.
Absolutely. We think about good relationships at work, and that includes with my colleagues and with my leader. Feeling appreciated is part of a good relationship with a leader. That's fundamental to that relationship. Those good relationships become a sort of psychological PPE for us, so that when we are placed in a stressful situation, the hull of the ship that we've been building together is strong. It's ready to weather that turbulence. And if we're not doing those small things on the front end, then we don't really have anything in the bank account to draw against. And so it's not something to do in the moment when you're asking for a favor or you're asking people to go the extra mile.
And that term went right past, you said the cloak of PPE or the hull of PPE. What did you just say?
Sorry, I mixed a boat, a plane, and PPE together. Didn't fully explain it. So let me back up a little bit. When we invest in solid relationships at work and when we invest in creating relationship capital, that serves as psychological PPE for us against
psychological PPE. Okay. That is beautiful.
And I liken it to a ship that is sailing into stormy seas. If we have done things along the way to strengthen the hull of that ship, people inside might be a little seasick. It's going to be uncomfortable, but we're going to make it through and it's not going to take on a lot of damage. You can't do that in the moment when you're in turbulence. It's not the time.
I love it. PPE, boats, planes, turbulence. Well done. Well done. All right. So there's a lot going on in the workforce. What makes up the clinician workforce? You've mentioned in your writings gender, age, cohorts, demographics, and you talk about moving from workforce as a problem to solve, but an asset to invest in. And HR managers are listening and they're salivating over this because they do get it. It's this question, does the rest of the organization get it? So how can a CMO reframe his or her conversations up to the board or with their financial partners, so that the investment in the human margin, things like staffing, recognition, psychological safety, are treated as a strategic asset that requires time and investment rather than a soft, squishy cost kind of thing?
The great news is we have emerging research about this, so it's easy to bring in some data to help support that cause. And I have found in my own work that when I'm talking to people at those levels, they speak the language of data and they speak the language of finance. And I have gotten so much more traction in bringing that information forward. Here's what this does to our productivity. Here's what this does to our financial impact, to the bottom line. I've gotten way more traction that way than trying to convince people to take care of people because it's the right thing to do. Because those other things feel really urgent and this one doesn't, right? Because when people are upset, when they're burned out, when they're contemplating leaving the organization, it's a slow burn. I mean, very few people are throwing their hands up in the moment and walking out in the middle of a case and saying never again. So we don't see the immediate impact of those investments, but the more we can bring in that research and data, I have found it helpful.
Have you done any type of ROI on this?
So we have some larger studies, and of course, they're not terribly precise because we're trying to generalize. But again, kind of going back to that idea of what metrics do we capture and track? Organizations are often not looking at those numbers, right? They're just looking at what is your quarterly revenue or expenses.
When you sit with HR, they will talk about attrition and retention, and they will quote these numbers, and they will give you their dashboard or whatever. It's really about not only losing nurses, phlebotomists, lab techs, the whole nine yards, and quantifying them, but the flip side is if we quantify our hours, if we quantify our leadership development, if we put a number in front of like setting up some kind of developmental skill sets for people, and that costs X, but the return is reducing that attrition. Have you done that kind of financial work with anybody?
At a macro level, we can see changes typically in trends around attrition and retention. That said, we can measure sentiment of whether or not people plan to leave. And sometimes that is a much more direct measure that is going to be more sensitive to our interventions.
And that you bake into an engagement survey as one of the key questions?
Yes. I mean, I am a fan of baking it into an engagement survey if that's done at a regular enough interval, or if you're doing some type of assessment around a specific program. I think that's also helpful to capture.
Perfect. All right. Ready for the next question? Okay.
Ready.
So your upcoming work on multi-generational teams and the book Genfluence, leading 5 different generations under one roof. What are some of the blind spots that we see generationally in physician leadership, and what should CMOs be thinking about in adapting their communication and their recognition styles so that as many of those generational folks feel like, yes, this place is for me and they have me in mind? How do we help people understand that?
I think for me, what I see in the physician workforce especially are sort of 2 fundamental misunderstandings. One is that younger physicians seem to not want to endure some of the same difficult conditions, perhaps that their older counterparts had to go through. And so there's this feeling of, well, I had to do that. I had to suck it up. I had to take 0 sick days for 3 years. Why aren't these people? So there's a sort of a disagreement or a misalignment of values there, without sometimes the recognition that compensation is not quite what it used to be relative to expenses and inflation. Autonomy has been diminished, and some of the other things that physicians in the past may have gotten out of that type of commitment, those things have changed. So I think that's thing one. Thing two is I think there's also a fundamental misunderstanding about Gen Z and their mental health. We tend to interpret Gen Z as a weak and fragile generation that just doesn't want to work hard. And yet, when we actually look at trends over time in their mental health on objective measures like emergency room visits for self-harm or suicidality or actual suicide, we see a tremendous spike in those behaviors up and to the right that we have not seen in past generations. And I will tell you, as a researcher, I have fundamentally changed my approach to how I work with students and employees from that generation, because I too thought maybe these people just kind of don't want to work hard and they need to suck it up. And yet, for them with that mental health background widely across the generation, it is probably the wisest thing they can do to be protective of their mental health. And that is something fundamentally that other generations have not had to experience or deal with in the same way.
Okay, I need to explore this with you so that I understand this. What I'm hearing is in the older days, in my generation and my predecessor generation, perhaps we should have been making that phone call, going to the emergency room, seeking help, but we didn't. So that we look at my generation or the prior generation and say they never went, they never had trouble coping. And then we look at Gen Z and say, look what they do. But what's really happening is they have great access and great self-awareness, and they're doing more appropriate. And we should have been doing that. And maybe it's not so different after all. Is that what you might be suggesting?
So yes, and there's actually another component to this. And this is the part that was most surprising to me. I think there's a normalization of caring for one's mental health that has happened over that course, that people are saying, oh, that probably would have been a good idea, But there is something else happening in this generation specifically. So prevailing theory, as of now, is that between the years of roughly 2010 and 2012, we had the introduction of 2 new technologies that gained mass adoption. Those were the smartphone, so internet in our pocket at all times, and introduction of social media with the like feature. So essentially, we gave humans the ability to have 24/7 connectivity to each other and to quantify social acceptance and rejection in a very measurable way. Now, we were all there then, right? I mean, you probably remember when you got your first phone or smartphone, but the difference in Gen Z is that when those technologies were gaining mass adoption, they were in their adolescent years, where the brain is going through a massive period of rewiring and is very sensitive to outside influence. And so rather than just a recognition that like mental health is important, we're actually seeing that there is a fundamental shift in the well-being of an entire generation, we believe, because of the timing of those technologies. And so in addition to some changing beliefs about how we should approach mental health, is a baseline level of mental health that is tremendously worse than prior generations, objectively speaking. And so with that, there's no amount of trying to toughen people up in the workforce that's going to undo an entire adolescent of neurological rewiring. So we're going to have to be very creative about how we design around that. And that might mean that we get more involved in thinking about how we could do gig work in healthcare, for example. We might need to leave capacity for mental health days that we didn't have to before. And as much as I think as a leader, I have struggled in feeling like, okay, we just need to equip them and they'll toughen up eventually. Getting more into this research, I'm learning that actually this is something that we probably won't be able to toughen up in the workforce. This is something that is a fundamental difference that we might have to design around.
I accept and appreciate exactly where you're coming from. What I am now thinking out loud with you is that in a way, hypothetically, they never had downtime as an adolescent. They were subjected to chronically, like any other bad drug or bad substance that hurts our capabilities and our capacities. And so they didn't even know how to even create their own downtime because it was constant. Because we didn't know any better, to be fair. I mean, people did know, but not the masses didn't know. And so they need more of that support to generate what good downtime looks like, how to stop those external influences on the way their brain operates. Is that a reasonable assumption of mine?
I think so. And I think it has implications for almost everything about the way we lead. So for example, we know that over 40% of Gen Z says, I can't do anything right in high school. That's their belief. And so when you think about implications for feedback as a leader and what that might mean for how you deliver feedback or how you encourage someone to speak up and ask questions when their baseline belief is that they can't do anything right in the first place, right? We also could think about this idea that there was a shared experience of putting yourself out there and maybe being accepted today and rejected tomorrow, and then accepted and then rejected for 3 days in a row. And you never really knew where you stood socially because it could change and crowds are fickle, right? So when I think about feedback, for example, there are people in other generations that might be like, look, tell me good job once every 3 years, I'm good. But for some of these younger generations, there's sort of this underlying question of, okay, but what about today? I mean, you told me good job yesterday, but is it still true today? What about tomorrow? And so even the frequency at which we thank people, recognize, notice, or give feedback, positive feedback, might need to change.
This is such a wonderful conversation. For me personally, I'm learning more than I anticipated that I would learn, which means there are plenty of people out there who are also learning as we're having this conversation. So it has been a real delight for me to have you on the show. I want to give you a chance to speak any last words or thoughts.
Look, I think the bottom line is when we're unsure of what to do in leadership or we're in tremendously difficult environments, which we are in healthcare right now, it is so hard. I think ultimately, if you genuinely care, I mean, really care about the people that you lead and serve, that's going to come through, right? That's the most important thing that you can do. If you genuinely don't, people are going to notice. And so I think that's first things first as a leader when you're unsure of where to start.
Very, very helpful conversation. Thank you so much for being on the show, Katherine.
It's great to be with you.
So everyone, you have been listening to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. Want to learn more about how to address the human margin at your organization? Connect with Katherine Meese. If you want to learn more about how to lead as a CMO, connect with me and check out our website, thefirechiefcmo.com, and connect with me on LinkedIn. I love talking with CMOs from all over the world, so get out there, be a good human, be a chief, invest in other humans, But whatever you do, in the words of Sergeant Phil Esterhaus, remember, let's be careful out there.